Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Haley with Haley Stitches and I have a super fun video for you today. I recently released a completely free quilt pattern called Charming Sawtooth. It's a baby quilt pattern that measures 40 inches square, and today I'm going to walk you through the entire assembly from beginning to end. This is the perfect quilt for a beginner because it uses the 2 at a time half square triangle method, and I wrote the instructions especially for a beginner quilter. All you need to get started is a charm pack and a yard of fabric, and I'm sure you already have that in your fabric stash. So let's get started. Before we get started, let's look over the supplies we need for this quilt. For the fabric, we're going to need 1 yard of background fabric and 1 charm pack. I am using the fabric collection called Christmas Morning by Layla Boutique. You'll also need a rotary mat and a rotary cutter, a long quilting ruler, and a square quilting ruler to trim our half square triangles. The half square triangles will be trimmed to 4.5 inch squares. So I have a 4.5 inch square ruler here, but you can use any square ruler. If you don't have a square ruler, you also can use your long quilting ruler. And lastly, we'll need a marking pen. So I like to use the friction pens. They actually disappear with heat, but you can use any marking utensil you have because all of the marks are going to be in our seam allowances, so you're not even going to know they're there. Now that we know what we need, let's start cutting our fabric. One thing I love about using pre-cuts is that it really cuts down on the time that you're spending cutting your fabric, and you can spend more time actually assembling your quilt and quilting. Because I don't know about you, but cutting is kind of my least favorite part of the process. So here I have my yard of background fabric, and what you want to do is fold it in half with the selvages together. So the selvages are the part on the end that might have the designer name. It just has a different feel. It's perforated almost, and you don't want this part to be in your quilt. So we are going to fold our yard of fabric with the selvages together and then place it on our cutting mat. Now we're going to take our long ruler and trim a little sliver off here. We want to make sure we have a nice clean 90-degree angle to work with. So I am just going to trim 1/4 inch or less off just to make sure that we have a nice even edge to start with. Okay, now we are ready to start cutting. So we want to cut 2 5-inch strips. And how I'm lining this up is I am using the black 5-inch line on my ruler, and I'm lining it up right on the edge of my background fabric there. I also want to line up the bottom with one of the lines on the ruler here. So I'm just kind of writing a dotted line to make sure that everything is squared up. Now that we've cut our 5-inch strips, we can set those aside. And next we're going to cut 3 8.5 inch wide strips. So my long ruler is only 6 inches wide. So I'm going to have to be a little bit creative about how I'm going to cut this. So let me show you what I am going to do. So when I need to cut a strip that's wider than my ruler, what I like to do is use the grid on my mat. Before you use the grid on your mat, you always want to double check that the lines are actually the right measurement. If your mat has been out in the sun, it might shrink, or if it's really old or maybe a different brand that you're not used to using, it actually might not be the correct measurement. My mat is exactly correct on the measurements, so it's totally fine for me to use it this way when I need to. So because we are cutting an 8.5 inch strip, I'm just going to go to 8.5, and that is right here. So I'm going to line up my ruler with that 8.5 inch mark. I'm going to line it up with 8.5 inch on the top side and also on the bottom side. So that is what I am going to do in order to cut my strips. So after I've cut all my strips, I have this much left. My cut of fabric was a little bit more than a yard. If you're using exactly 1 yard of fabric, you'll only have about 1/2 inch left. After cutting our strips, we're going to subcut the strips into smaller squares and rectangles. So I'm gonna start with our 5-inch strips here. The first thing we want to do is line up our edges with one of the lines on our mat, and then we're going to trim off these selvages. The great thing about this pattern is that it actually comes with a cutting diagram, and I loved the diagram when I was a beginner, so that's why I included it in the pattern. So it makes it really easy to understand what you need to cut from your yard of fabric. So for this first strip of fabric, we're going to cut 8 5-inch squares out of this fabric. So the fabric's already 5 inches tall, so now we just need to go 5 inches wide. And I'm gonna leave it folded in half just to make the cutting time go a little quicker. So I'm lining up the 5-inch line here, and then I'm going to cut. So here we have our 8 5-inch squares, and for this pattern we need a total of 14 5-inch squares. So now we're going to cut into that next 5-inch strip that we cut. Again, lining it up on our mat and then trimming off the selvages. And we already cut 8 squares, so to get a total of 14, we need 6 more 5-inch squares. Now we have our 5-inch squares cut out, and now it is time to subcut our 8.5-inch strips. Just like before, we're going to trim off our selvage edge. And I am cutting this exactly the same way that the instructions reference on the cutting instructions. So for this first strip, we're going to cut 4 8.5-inch squares. So once again, because my ruler isn't 8.5 inches wide, we're going to be using the lines on our cutting mat. So I have it lined up here on the 8-inch mark, and we're going to bump up to the 16.5 line to get an 8.5-inch square. Now we're moving on to our next 8.5-inch strip, trimming the selvages, and we are going to cut this strip into 2 8.5-inch squares because we need a total of 6 for this pattern. So because this is folded in half, we only have to do this one time. And the next measurements we need to get out of the rest of this 8.5-inch strip and our last 8.5-inch strip, we need to get a total of 10 4.5-inch by 8.5-inch rectangles. So I am going to cut one out of here based on the cutting instructions. So we're going to line this up on my 4.5-inch line. Then I'll add the rest of this to my scrap bin, and we can actually get the rest of our rectangles from our last piece. So let's trim the selvage off of that. And then from this piece, we want to get a total of 9 4.5-inch by 8.5-inch rectangles. So we're just gonna line up the 4.5-inch line there and keep cutting. So far we've cut 8 out of there, but we actually need to cut 9. So I'm gonna open up this last piece, and then we're going to get our last rectangle from here. So before we move on, we can double check that we have everything that we need. We need 42 5-inch squares, otherwise known as a charm pack. This will be our fabric A. We need 14 5-inch squares. The background fabric will be our fabric B. We need 6 8.5-inch squares and 10 4.5-inch by 8.5-inch rectangles. Now that we have all of our fabric cut out and ready to go, we can start piecing. Our next step is making half square triangles. So we are going to use the 2 at a time half square triangle assembly method. For this pattern, we're going to make 2 different half square triangle pairings. So for the first pairing, we are going to take 2 fabric A fabrics. So both will come from our charm pack. The next pairing will be 1 fabric A fabric and 1 fabric B fabric. We're going to make 28 half square triangles that are the AA pairing and 28 half square triangles that are the AB pairing. Well, let me show you exactly how to do the 2 at a time method, and I'm going to use the most contrasting fabrics just for demonstration purposes. The first step is to draw a diagonal line on the back side of one of your fabrics. So I am going to do that using my large ruler and my friction pen. If you're using a solid background fabric, they typically don't have a right side or a wrong side. My fabric looks solid in the camera, but it's actually not. It has a polka dot pattern on it. Let me show you. So you can see the polka dots there. They're not very bright on this side, they don't really stand out. That's how I know that this is the wrong side of the fabric. If you look on this side, you can see them a bit brighter and they pop off a little bit on the fabric. So that is how I'm telling the right side from the wrong side for my fabric here. If you're looking at a more designed fabric like this side is obviously the right side and this side is obviously the wrong side. It's more faded and dull. So that's how you can tell the difference. So now we have our marked fabric square and we want to pair it with our other fabric square, and we want to pair them together with the right sides together. So that means we're going to pair the pretty sides of each fabric together. So now it should look like this. Feel free to pin these together if you are brand new to quilting. It might help you out. But the next step is to sew 1/4 inch away from the marked line. So you're going to take this to your sewing machine and sew 1/4 inch away on this side and then 1/4 inch away on this side. This is what your half square triangles should look like at this step, so you can see that I've stitched on either side of that marked line. So this is where the fun happens. So we have this marked line. Now we want to actually cut on that marked line. So I'm going to take my ruler and line it up with the line, corner to corner. And I'm going to take my rotary cutter and cut along that line. So you can see now we have 2 identical half square triangles, and they both will end up looking the same. And the next step is to press these. So with your iron, you're going to want to press to the darker side. So some of your fabric might actually be really close in color, especially if you have a light background and a lighter fabric from your charm square, but choose whichever one would be darker. In this scenario, it's going to be the red and white. So I am going to take this to my ironing board and press it towards the dark side like that. This is what our half square triangles look like after I have pressed them. So you can see we have the little dog ears here that we're going to have to trim off. We want our final measurement for our half square triangles to be 4.5 inches. So I happen to have a 4.5 inch square ruler. You can use whatever square ruler you have. You can also use your long quilting ruler. So the important part for trimming half square triangles is to watch this diagonal line of your ruler. We want to line up the diagonal line with the diagonal on our half square triangle. So line it up until the entire ruler is in the square of your fabric. And your diagonal should be matching the whole way. First, I'm going to trim these 2 sides. And then I'm going to rotate it around. Move all that out of the way. And then do the same. So line up the diagonal again. And then you can line up your trimmed edge with the edge of the ruler, and then trim your last 2 edges. This is what our final half square triangle will look like. It measures 4.5 inches. To finish piecing, you're going to repeat the 2 at a time half square triangle method until you have a total of 28 A half square triangles and 28 AB half square triangles. If you want this to go a little bit faster, there is a method called chain piecing, and I have a tip for how to make trimming go a little bit quicker. Both of these tips you can find in my quilting tips video. I'll link it in the description and above. As you're piecing together your half square triangles, try to keep it super scrappy. So I am gonna kind of randomly choose fabrics to put together. The only thing I will say is that you may not want to put a bright white fabric with the white background. So I'm gonna save all of my white fabrics to pair with a darker contrasting fabric. This quilt pattern is made up of 3 different sections. So we're gonna get started with section A. And it's going to look like this. So as we're piecing each section together, you can randomly choose which half square triangle to put in what spot. I like to lay everything out so I can see that it looks good together before I start sewing. For this entire quilt, we're going to use a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and we're going to press all of our seams open. One more thing to note before we get started is it's really important to pay attention to which directions your diagonals are going, because that's going to give us a great effect at the end of the quilt. I'm going to show you how to make one of these blocks, but the pattern calls for 4 section A blocks. So you can make them all at the same time with the chain piecing method. The first step for this block assembly is to piece these 2 pieces together. So how we're going to do that is flip it together and line it up, and then we are going to sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance on this line. After you've pieced and pressed those pieces, it will look like this, and then remember to press all of your seams open on the back. So we are going to place that right back here, and then the next step is to piece these two pieces together, so your 1/2 square triangle unit and your 8.5 inch square. Now we're moving on to step 3, and we're going to piece these two 1/2 square triangles together. Once these two are together, we're going to finish out the row and add on this 1/2 square triangle. Now that both of these parts are assembled, we can sew them together. So we're going to sew this section to this section. After this step, you can really see the blocks start to come together. So next we're going to piece together this 1/2 square triangle and this rectangle. After we piece these together, we're just going to set it aside while we piece the top row. So to piece the top row, you're going to piece together these 1/2 square triangles, and then you're going to add on the rectangle. Now that all of our individual squares and rectangles are sewn together, we can piece together this whole block. So first, we're going to piece these two pieces together. And next, to finish off this section A block, we're going to sew on the top row. This is what our finished section A block will look like. You should end up with a total of 4 of these blocks. Now we can move on to our next section, which is section B. You'll end up with a total of 2 of these blocks. Our first step for assembly is to sew together these two 1/2 square triangles, and you'll also sew together these two 1/2 square triangles. Next, we're going to sew both of these rows together to form one large 1/2 square triangle unit. The final step for section B will be to sew your 8.5 inch square onto your 1/2 square triangles. This is what your finished section B unit will look like. You'll need 2 of these to finish your quilt. Now we're at the final step in our block assembly. This is our section C block. You will need 2 section C blocks to finish this quilt. The first step is going to be to sew together these two 1/2 square triangles and these two 1/2 square triangles. After these 1/2 square triangles are assembled, we want to sew them to either side of this rectangle, making sure that the diagonals of your 1/2 square triangles are always pointing towards the center of the block. Now that this side of our block is assembled, we are going to move over to working on this side. Next, we want to sew our 1/2 square triangles together. So we're going to sew these two together and these two together. After these are pieced, we're going to sew these two 1/2 square triangle units together to form one large 1/2 square triangle unit, and then we are going to sew this unit onto this unit. This is what our finished section C block will look like, and you should end up with 2 of these blocks. Now we can move on to our quilt assembly. So we are going to assemble all of these blocks into 3 rows and then piece those rows together to get our finished quilt. So these are our section C blocks. We have 2 of them. So the first step that we want to do is piece these 2 together into one long row. So I am going to place them together like this, flip this block around, and then we will sew it in the middle like this. And I know I'm not going to be able to get everything into the frame, so I will definitely add a little graphic to make things a little bit easier. There's also a great graphic in the pattern, so don't forget to download that. This row of your section C blocks actually ends up being the center row of your quilt. So we'll set this aside while we piece together the top and bottom rows. The top and bottom rows of this quilt are laid out exactly the same way. So in order to make the top and bottom rows, what you want to do is take one section B piece and put it in the center, and then 2 section A pieces will be on either side. After you've assembled your sections together, your top row will end up looking like this. You'll have to make a duplicate row for your bottom row, and then when you assemble it, this will be your top row. Your section C blocks will be your middle row, and then you'll rotate this around like this, and you will get your bottom row. To finish your assembly, you're going to sew together your top row, center row, and bottom row to get your finished quilt. For binding and backing fabric requirements, you can download the free pattern from the description below. If you liked today's video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you want to see more quilting tutorials just like this one, let me know in the comments below. I'll see you all next time. Bye!